The taste of copper filled my mouth as I bit down on my tongue to keep from screaming. My father's grip on my shoulder tightened as he shoved me against the living room wall. My head hit the family portrait behind me with a sharp crack. Glass fragments from the broken frame scattered across the hardwood floor like my shattered illusions about unconditional love. "Ungrateful brat," Mom hissed, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light as she reached for her designer purse. "You think you're better than us now with your fancy job?" Behind her, Ava, my 8-year-old daughter, stood frozen in the hallway. Her backpack still hung from one shoulder. Her wide brown eyes took in every brutal second, the same eyes that had watched me work double shifts for 3 years to keep us afloat while my parents demanded I bankroll my sister's lifestyle. "Mommy," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of my own ragged breathing. "My name is Nicole. I'm 34 and a single mother. This is the story of how I learned that blood doesn't make you family. Boundaries do." The text message that had triggered this nightmare still glowed on my phone screen where it had fallen during the struggle. "Rent's due tomorrow. Kayla needs $1,200. We raised you better than to abandon family. 2 hours." That's how long it took my parents to drive across town and force their way through my back door when I didn't immediately transfer money to my 28-year-old sister. She hadn't held a job longer than 3 months in her entire adult life. I tasted the metallic tang as I struggled to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were demanding I pay Kayla's rent while standing in the home I'd bought with money I'd saved by working overtime in the ICU, money I'd hidden away every month while they believed I was barely scraping by. "We'll camp out here until you come to your senses," Dad announced, settling onto my couch like he owned it. "Clearly you've forgotten what family loyalty means." Mom nodded, already making herself comfortable. "Maybe watching us struggle will remind you where you came from." I looked at Ava's tear-streaked face, then at the cut on my fingertips from where my head had hit the wall. Something inside me that had bent and yielded for 34 years suddenly snapped into place like a bone setting after a break. "Get out," I said, my voice steady as surgical steel. Mom actually laughed. "Or what? You'll call the police on your own parents? Even you aren't that pathetic." I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to Ava, took her trembling hand and led her to my bedroom. The lock clicked behind us with the finality of a closing chapter. That night, as Ava slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and connected dots I'd been deliberately avoiding. The increasing demands for money, the emotional manipulation when I hesitated, the way they'd always prioritized Kayla's wants over my needs, and now, violence. The next morning, after dropping Ava at school through the back door while my parents argued in the kitchen, I drove to the courthouse. At the courthouse, the clerk didn't even blink when I showed her the photos I'd taken of my injuries. "Emergency restraining order will be processed within 4 hours," she said. "The responding officer will serve it when they remove them from your property." What my parents didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that 18 months earlier, I'd quietly purchased their rental house through an LLC. The same house they'd lived in for 6 years. The one they'd been laid on rent for the past 3 months. As their landlord through my property management company, I'd been receiving their payment history reports. I watched the mounting late fees accumulate month after month. The house they were about to lose. I returned home that afternoon to wait for Officer Martinez. When he arrived at my duplex, my parents' indignation was spectacular. "This is harassment," Mom shrieked as he explained the restraining order. "We're her family." "Ma'am," he replied calmly, "family members who commit domestic violence aren't exempt from consequences." As they gathered their things, Dad's face was purple with rage. "You'll regret this, Nicole. Mark my words." I stood in my doorway, Ava behind me, both of us watching as they loaded their overnight bags into their car. For the first time in my life, I felt something I'd never experienced around my parents' peace. But the real reckoning was still coming. 3 days later, my parents received a certified letter at their rental house, a 30-day eviction notice from their landlord, me. The property manager I'd hired delivered the news with professional efficiency. "They've been 3 months behind on rent," she reported back to me. When I mentioned the eviction, the older woman became hysterical, started screaming about their daughter being vindictive. That same afternoon, while running errands, Kayla cornered me in the grocery store parking lot. Her face was twisted with fury. She must have been watching my usual routine, waiting for her chance to confront me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she spat. "Mom and Dad are devastated." I looked at her, really looked. Designer clothes, fresh manicure, luxury car she'd borrowed from her latest boyfriend, not a care in the world about the financial destruction she'd left in her wake. "Devastated," I repeated. "Were they devastated when they assaulted me in front of my daughter because I wouldn't pay your rent?" Her expression faltered for just a moment. That's not what happened." "There are photographs, Kayla, hospital records, police reports." I adjusted my purse strap, feeling strangely calm. "But don't worry about Mom and Dad. I'm sure you'll step up and help them out. After all, family is supposed to take care of family, right?" The color drained from her face as she realized what I was implying. She turned and walked away without another word. On the eviction date, I positioned myself across the street from my childhood home. I watched as my parents loaded their belongings into a rented U-Haul. The irony was perfect. They were being forced out of the house they'd raised me in, the house where I'd learned that love came with conditions and strings attached. When Mom spotted me, she marched across the street like a woman possessed. "You can't be serious," she breathed, her face flushed with humiliation. "We're your parents, Nicole. You can't just throw us away." "The way you threw me against the wall?" I replied. "The way you've thrown away every boundary I've ever tried to set?" Dad joined her, his jaw clenched with barely contained rage. "You think owning property makes you powerful? You're still the same scared little girl who used to cry when we raised our voices." "No," I said, feeling Ava's small hand slip into mine. "I'm the woman who learned that respect isn't inherited. It's earned. And you lost the right to mine when you chose violence over love." For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle for words. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned away. Mom made one last desperate play. "What about Ava? You're depriving her of her grandparents." I looked down at my daughter, who squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm protecting her from people who think love is conditional," I said, "just like someone should have protected me." As we walked back to our car, Ava tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, are you sad?" I considered the question as I buckled her seatbelt. "I'm relieved, baby. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the rightest thing to do." 6 months had passed since the eviction when my phone buzzed with updates I no longer wanted to hear. Sarah, my cousin, who had always served as the family's unofficial news network, had been trying to keep me informed about the aftermath. According to her latest messages, my parents had moved in with Kayla temporarily, but that arrangement lasted exactly 2 weeks before she kicked them out. They were now renting a studio apartment above a failed restaurant, barely making ends meet and arguing constantly about whose fault their situation was. Kayla had apparently moved to Florida with a new boyfriend. She cut off all contact with the family and left behind a trail of unpaid debts and broken promises. Even Sarah hadn't heard from her in 3 months. I deleted Sarah's messages without responding, then blocked her number. That chapter of my life was permanently closed. Instead, I focused on the future Ava and I were building. I'd been promoted to head nurse in the cardiac unit. Ava had started taking art lessons and was thriving in her new school. We'd bought a small house with a garden where she could play safely, where raised voices meant laughter instead of fear. The rental property had been sold to a young family who sent me thank you cards every Christmas. The restraining order remained in place permanently. In all this time, my parents had made no attempts to contact me through legal channels or mutual acquaintances. I'd made peace with the fact that some relationships can't be repaired. They can only be ended with dignity. Last month, Ava presented me with a drawing she'd made in art class. It showed 2 figures holding hands in front of a small house. The sun was shining overhead and flowers were blooming in the yard. "This is us," she explained proudly, "in our happy place." I hung it on our refrigerator right next to the photo of us at the zoo last weekend, both of us grinning widely, free from the weight of other people's expectations and demands. That night, as I tucked her into bed, Ava looked up at me with those wise brown eyes. "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa learned their lesson?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I think some people can't learn, sweetheart, but we learned something important, that we deserve to be treated with kindness, even by family." She nodded solemnly, then smiled, "Especially by family." The hardest lesson I ever learned was that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who make their love the most conditional of all. Breaking free from that cycle wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about showing my daughter that love should never come with violence, demands, or fear. If you're sitting there right now feeling that familiar knot of guilt because someone in your family treats you like an obligation instead of a blessing, I want you to know something. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions, finances, or consequences. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Your worth isn't determined by how much you sacrifice for people who refuse to sacrifice anything for you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the children watching, is to walk away. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles. Zero cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.